winter horse care advice online can be pretty unrealistic, expensive, or sometimes very obvious it's written by an individual who does not live anywhere where water freezes solid. So let's talk about some winter horse care hacks for the horse owner, particularly if you live in the cold climate. But really, this video is for anybody, and stick around till the end because I've got some really good ones in here for you. So let's start with probably the biggest concern for horse owners in the wintertime, and that is water. So how do you get a horse to maintain hydration in the wintertime? Now remember, probably just like you and I, horses do not like drinking water that is icy cold or warm, like terribly warm water. But there's been studies conducted and they found that horses seem to like lukewarm water best. So if you can, get yourself a water bucket with a heater, or I'm actually going to start to walk this way because I don't actually know where that goes and I'm by myself. You can get a heated water bucket, or you can take an electric kettle, get the water nice and hot, and then just dump it in your cold water. So that's one way to get your horse to drink more, is simply making the water a temperature that is more likely to get the horse to drink. Lukewarm water, if you're wondering, is considered anything between 45 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you might be thinking, Adri, what's the big deal with horses drinking in the wintertime? Well, if a horse is dehydrated, they're more likely to experience colic. Now, as someone who works in the veterinary industry and has for quite some time, you would not believe how prevalent colic is, particularly in wintertime. In fact, in the cold months is when I think we tend to see it the most. And that is thought to be because when water's icy cold, horses tend to consume less water. So then they're dehydrated, their GI tract is not able to move the feed along. The food can be all dry and clumpy, and then it just gets stuck in the GI tract. And then you wind up with an impaction colic. Now, for those of you who do not actually have a heated water bucket or an easy way to transport hot water to your horse, all is not lost. You can insulate your water buckets. A couple different ways to do this. I think the easiest way that I've found is to put your water bucket inside of a larger water bucket so that you can insulate it. Now, insulating it can be as simple as putting some straw or some spare hay. Actually, if you use hay, the horse is probably gonna eat it all. So using some straw to kind of insulate and keep the heat in that water bucket. This way, it's not quite as icy cold and the horse is more likely to drink from it. So remember, cold horses don't just stop needing water, they just stop wanting it. Well, here's another great winter hack. Adding salt to your horse's feed. So you're probably aware that horses do not like salt nearly as much in the wintertime as they do in the summertime. And even in the summertime, they can't really lick the right amount of salt that they actually require. They can't make up for the amount of salt that they're losing. So what you should do in this case is add loose salt or equine electrolytes to your horse's feed. Because after all, salt does drive thirst. And if they're feeling a little thirsty because of all the salt, they're more likely to drink. So they'll stay hydrated and the risk of colic goes down. For most horses, 1 to 2 tablespoons of loose salt added to feed once daily will suffice. Only add salt if your horse has immediate access to unfrozen water. So I realized when I got home from finishing my video, I was looking at my notes and I realized, oh my gosh, I forgot one of my favorite hacks for wintertime, and that is to include flotation devices in your water so that the water doesn't freeze on you. They are usually little balls that you place in your water, usually 2 to 3, or more if it's a big trough. And they just bob and keep the water moving so that it doesn't freeze. Now, water will eventually freeze if it's too cold, but it's an awesome hack for when you need a little bit of a buffer between you getting out there to chop the ice and it freezing on you. So I'm sure everybody has experienced the same exact thing where you go out, you pick up your horse's hoof, and they've got a big old snowball under there. They get little snow impactions under their hooves. How do I prevent this? What's the big deal? Well, it does make the horse lame first and foremost, but if that wasn't enough for you, it's putting uneven tension and uneven stress on joints, tendons, ligaments. It's just very uncomfortable. Imagine if you had to walk with a giant ball of ice in your shoe. You wouldn't like it either. If you can get out to the barn semi-regularly, if you just take some cooking spray and spray it under your horse's hoofs, this is a great way to create a barrier so that the snow and ice can't accumulate under your horse's hooves. You can also do this with a layer of petroleum jelly. But like I said, this is only temporary. Always pick out your horse's hooves before you turn them out, not just after you take them out of the pasture and you ride them. Before you bring them back out, make sure their hooves are nice and free and clear of debris. Believe it or not, most winter horse injuries actually don't occur under the saddle. It happens in the field. And these impaction snowballs are a big culprit. Consider getting horseshoes that have the studs underneath. The studs and torque provided with studded horseshoes can sometimes provide just that much traction for your horse to avoid a slip and fall and potentially an injury. Some people might be thinking, hey, you know what? My horse is slipping all over the field. I'm going to get them some studded horseshoes. That could be a good idea. But in some circumstances, it doesn't actually make sense and can put the horse in further potential danger because uneven footing and traction can put some pretty significant stress on the joints. So if that's the case, you might want to look for shoes that are flat on the bottom or even just having your horse all natural and barefoot in the pasture. Sometimes that's the safer option. Remember, when it comes to shoeing with horses in the wintertime, usually less is more. Let's talk about heating and feeding. It might sound kind of weird, but in horses, hay is a heater. How is that possible? It's just grass. Well, let me explain. When horses eat hay, it does get fermented in the hind gut, and that in and of itself creates heat. So when your horse is eating, they're literally working to keep themselves warm. If you're concerned about making sure your horse stays nice and toasty, make sure they have 24/7 access to hay. That way they can feed their internal furnace, so to speak. When the temperatures drop, which is usually overnight, consider giving them additional hay instead of in the daytime when the sun's out and they don't really need to keep that furnace running quite as much. If you're concerned about your horse gobbling too much too quickly, you can always put your hay in a slow feeder. That way your horse has a nice, steady, constant feed of hay. So if your horse is cold, before you throw another blanket on him, think, does my horse have enough hay? If not, try some more hay first. Extra hay can fix more problems than another blanket. Another hack for winter is remembering that timing does matter when it comes to feeding your horse. I know plenty of horses are only on hay a couple times a day. If that is the case, give your evening portion of hay before the temperature drops. That way their furnace is already kicked on and heated up and doing its thing. This keeps fermentation heating peaking overnight. Let's talk about some blanket related hacks. These are always a hot button issue. Here's a hack. Stop guessing if your horse is cold. Instead of throwing a blanket on or keeping it off and crossing your fingers and hoping you made the right decision, try feeling or palpating behind your horse's elbow or under the shoulder. A lot of people might think, oh, well, if feel the horse's ears, but horses are a little bit different than other animals. And cold ears does not equal a cold horse. A more reliable way to measure internal temperature, in lieu of having a thermometer and checking it rectally, let's be honest, that's a little tedious to be doing every single day, and I don't think your horse wants that done every single day. You can always feel behind their elbow or under the shoulder, and if it's cooler than the rest of their body feels, give them the benefit of the doubt, throw another blanket on, and make sure they have extra hay. This way you're not just adding blankets because you're cold. Remember, horses handle the cold much better than us bald humans do, because, relatively speaking, we don't really have much hair, and the hair that we do have, it's not really keeping us warm. So just because you're cold doesn't mean your horse is cold. Here's a hack for drying your wet blankets when you don't have access to a heated barn. First, swap out blankets if you can. Every horse owner should have at least one extra blanket. They should have one to wash, one to wear, and one to spare. But that's not always reasonable because horse blankets are hundreds of dollars sometimes. But having at least one extra blanket is super beneficial for this hack right here. Swap out the blankets and hang your wet, soiled blanket next to airflow, not necessarily next to a heat source. The airflow is what's going to dry your blanket rather than the heat from, let's say, a radiator or a barn propane heater. I found sometimes if you just swing your blanket over a fence or across a spare stall door, that can be an excellent drying rack. Of course, consider if it's going to be a fire hazard, like don't drape your blanket over the indoor arena door if there's a heater right next to it. Just be smart about it, okay? Here's another winter barn hack. Remember that horse sheltering is way more important than horse blanketing, because it's not really the temperature that you're protecting your horse from. Horses are actually very well equipped to maintain their body temperature and handle the cold, but what they can't really tolerate is the wind chill. So a shelter is actually protecting them from the wind chill first and foremost. A horse out of the wind is definitely going to stay warmer. If you had to choose between putting another blanket on your horse or putting your horse in a turnout with a shelter, option 2, always put your horse in a pasture that has a turnout shelter. If you happen to not have access to a pasture with turnout shelter, then by all means double up your blankets. Or consider putting your horse in a pasture that has a wind barrier, like a line of trees. Even that line of trees can help break that wind down. Now, we are always, as horse owners in the wintertime, talking about how cold our horses must be, and we want to keep them nice and toasty and warm. Something we might not think about as often is the ice, because believe it or not, ice poses a much bigger risk to your horse than the cold does. Remember, horses are outdoor animals. They tolerate the cold very well. But ice causes catastrophic injuries. Simply avoid turnout or skip it entirely if your horse's pasture is like an ice skating rink. It's not worth the headache. You can always turn out your horse in the indoor arena. You can walk your horse around in hand just to give them some exercise, but it's better to keep your horse cooped up in a stall for a couple of days rather than turning them out in conditions that are unsafe. If that's not possible, consider buying a bag of sand and throwing that on the ice instead of salt, because we don't want our horse to be tempted to lick this. The sand does a really good job of providing some extra traction on the ice for your horse. Okay, so far we've talked a lot about, things to make your horse safer, more comfortable, healthier in the wintertime, but what about our humans? We matter as well. Not as much, I don't think, but we do. Don't worry, I've got some hacks for the humans as well. Always dress for stopping and not riding. Dress for when you're just standing there and not moving. it's easier to take off some layers when you're riding than it is to be standing there in the freezing cold as you're brushing your horse. I know a lot of people might be like, oh, well, I got sweaty when I ride. You know what? Take some layers off then. But if you don't have extra layers to put on, you're going to be suffering more than if you just had to remove a layer or two. You'll be so happy that you put extra layers on, even if you end up having to take them off while riding. Another hack for the winter equestrian, I think, is to find horse clothing like equestrian wear that says windproof. I don't think the thickness really matters as much. There's something called Thinsulate where it's not so much thick material, but it's made specifically for riding in winter or just being around horses in the winter time. So thickness doesn't matter so much, but windproof material will definitely save your buns. Another hack, which is kind of controversial, I've been in some debates with people over this, is that I am team mittens over gloves any day of the week, because the gloves separate your fingers and they just feel isolated, whereas in mittens they can, retain their heat, like collects in the mitten. I don't know if that's scientifically accurate, but I definitely feel like my fingers stay toastier if I wear mittens. Now, you shouldn't ride in mittens, very, very unsafe, especially since you have to have the rein between your ring and pinky finger. So it wouldn't really be possible to hold them appropriately with mittens on, but for doing short chores, put some mittens on. Furthermore, you can try putting a pair of latex gloves or latex adjacent gloves underneath your gloves. It really does help keep the heat in. So you're welcome for that. Here's another trick. Just tell yourself you're only going to go out into the freezing cold for 5 minutes, and then you'll come right back into the nice warm car, barn, wherever you are. This, I think, helps because realistically, you're going to be out in the cold for like 1 to 2 hours, depending on what you're doing. But I think if you say that to yourself, you're like, what am I doing with my life? Why am I out in this like sub-degree weather? Nobody else is insisting on doing their hobbies in the wintertime when it's this cold. But horse people, we're a weird people. We're a weird breed. So I think sometimes if I'm like, oh, it won't be that long, I know I'm lying to myself, but it helps me deal with it when I have to go out in the freezing cold and I really don't want to. So if you're surviving winter with horses, you're doing hard things on purpose. And just know that you're not alone. There's a lot of us. There's a lot of nutty horse people out there, especially the ones who live in the winter climate. Like, what are we doing? I don't know. I hate the cold, but because I have a horse, it's probably the only reason why I step outside in the wintertime. If this video helped you, consider subscribing to my channel because I make bunches of horse care videos. Sometimes I do horse entertainment videos. So if that's of interest to you, definitely let me know in the comments, what is your go-to horse winter hack? Riders and owners, I want to hear it all. I'm always looking to steal better ideas. I started this video walking, but I've never actually been on this trail before. So I don't really want to get myself in a pickle where I don't really know my way back because it like splits off a bunch of times. But I wanted to focus on the video, not like focusing on, am I going to get lost? Am I going to get murdered? Also, you all heard, I was wicked out of breath just walking up a tiny little hill with like 2 inches of snow. So having a good sit was good for me. But now my buns are freezing, so I'm going to go get warm. Stay warm, everybody. I will see you guys next time. Bye for now.